I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was at my desk, catching up on the bank balance and wondering if Fritz had enough time for the roast when the doorbell rang. Normally, a ring at 3:45 p.m. is an annoyance because it's the tail end of Nero Wolfe's afternoon session with the orchids. He's up in the plant rooms from 4 to 6, and he treats those 2 hours like a religious retreat. Anything that threatens to bleed into his schedule usually gets the same look he gives a plate of overcooked broccoli. I looked at the monitor. It was a man who looked like he had been folded into a suit 2 sizes too small and then sat on. He was holding a briefcase as if it contained the secret to cold fusion, and he was sweating despite the cool October breeze. I went to the door, slid the bolt, and opened a crack. "Yes?" I asked, giving him the professional Goodwin grin that tells people I'm friendly but capable of bouncing them if necessary. "I must see Mr. Wolfe. It's a matter of industrial integrity. My name is Jerome Vane. I'm the chief chemist for the Duquesne Chocolate Company." Burr raised an eyebrow. "Duquesne made the bars I usually grabbed at the newsstand when I was in a hue." "Rye. Mr. Wolfe is currently occupied with a phalaenopsis. He doesn't see anyone without an appointment, especially not when he's about to go up to the roof. It's about the Shostakovich blend," Vane said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's been compromised. If the formula is leaked before the Centennial Gala, the company is finished. I have $5,000 in cash in briefcase just for a consultation." Money talks, but in this house, it usually has to shout to get Wolfe to move a muscle. However, $5,000 for a consultation is a loud enough whisper. I told him to wait, went into the office, and buzzed the plant rooms. "Yes, Archie?" Wolfe's voice came through the inter-office phone, sounding like a disgruntled bear. "Mr. Jerome Vane is at the door. He's the head chemist for Duquesne Chocolate. He says their secret formula is being sabotaged or stolen, and he's brought a $5,000 retainer just to say hello. He looks like he's about to have a stroke on our welcome mat." Here was a long silence. I could almost hear Wolfe weighing the 180 minutes of orchid time against the prospect of a bank account replenishment bore. "Is he wearing a hat?" Wolfe asked. "A fedora. Cheap. Tell him to leave it in the hall. Give him 5 minutes. I shall be down momentarily." I let Vane in. He sat on the edge of the red leather chair, clutching his briefcase. He didn't look at the shelves of books or the globe. He just stared at the door to the hall. When Wolfe finally entered, he didn't walk. He moved like a mountain being pushed by a gentle breeze. He settled into his custom-made chair, which is the only piece of furniture in the world that can comfortably accommodate his 1/7 of a ton, and sighed. "Well, Mr. Vane?" Wolfe didn't look at the briefcase. He looked at the clock. "You have disrupted a very delicate repotting of a cattleya. It had better be significant." Vane leaned forward. "Mr. Wolfe, for 60 years, Duquesne has produced the Midnight Velvet Blend. It is the backbone of our export business. 3 days ago, a batch was produced that tasted wrong, not spoiled, different. Someone had altered the roasting temperature and the alkalization process, and this morning I found this in my private safe." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a ransom note. It was a recipe, but with several ingredients crossed out in red ink and replaced with chemical notations. Wolfe squinted at the paper without touching it. "I am not a chemist, Mr. Vane. I am a private investigator." "It's not just the formula," Vane hissed. "The person who did this left a note on the back. Look." Wolfe flipped the paper with a letter opener. On the reverse, in neat block letters, it read, "The master's palate is fading. By Friday, the world will know Duquesne is just sugar and dust. Enjoy the bitterness." Wolfe's eyes went shut. "This is his version of high-speed processing. You have suspects?" "The board of directors," Vane said. 4 people have access to that safe. We are 3 days away from the centennial celebration where the new batch is to be debuted. If the formula is leaked to our rivals at Galt and Sons, or if the gala batch is ruined, the stock will plummet. The board is already at each other's throats about a potential buyout. Wolfe opened his eyes. He hates the idea of a master being insulted, even a master of chocolate. More importantly, he hates people who use anonymous notes to disrupt the orderly flow of commerce and dinner. Archie, Wolfe said, looking at me, it seems we are tea, or be concerned with confectionery. Mr. Vane, the 5,000 will cover the preliminary inquiry. Archie will escort you out and take down the names of your board members. I have an appointment with Dendrobium. He stood up. The consultation was over. Vane looked stunned, but I steered him toward the door. As I reached for my notebook, I caught a glimpse of Wolfe. He wasn't looking at the stairs. He was staring at that piece of paper with the red ink, and he had that look in his eye, the one that meant someone was eventually going to regret ever picking up a pen. The following morning, the brownstone didn't just feel like a house, it felt like a fortress, under siege by the very smell of the Duquesne Empire. Jerome Vane had returned, but this time he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by the Ma, N, who sat at the top of the chocolate pyramid. A personage who moved through my front door as if he were planning to buy the limestone it was carved from. This was Sterling Duquesne, the grandson of the founder, a man whose face was plastered on every high-end box of truffles from Manhattan to Marseille. He was tall, silver-haired, and possessed the kind of tan you can only get by spending your BY. Enters on a yacht, and your summers ignoring the taxman. I showed them into the office. Wolfe was already behind his desk, having finished his morning session with the orchids and a breakfast of shirred eggs with chives. He was reading a book on the history of the Habsburgs, and he didn't bother to look up until the two men were fully inside the room. This is a move Wolfe uses to establish territory. It tells the visitor that their presence is merely a footnote to his current interest. Mr. Duquesne, I said, performing the introductions. And you remember Mr. Vane from yesterday? Wolfe closed his book, marking the place with a thin strip of gold-tooled leather. He inclined his head about 1/8 of an inch. Gentlemen, please be seated, but Sterling Duquesne didn't sit immediately. He paced the length of the Persian rug, eyeing the bookshelves. I'm told you're the best, Wolfe. I'm also told you're the hardest. I don't mind the difficulty. I care about the fact that by Friday night, I have to stand in front of 300 investors and the international press to unveil the centennial creme. Right now, I can't even be sure the batch in the vats isn't poison, let alone a masterpiece. Poison is a legal matter for the police, Mr. Duquesne, Wolfe said, his voice as dry as a cracker. Industrial sabotage is a matter for me. Mr. Vane informed me of a compromised formula and a threatening note. Is there more? Duquesne stopped pacing and dropped into the red leather chair. He looked at Vane, then back at Wolfe. The note was just the beginning. Last night, the plant's security system was bypassed. No alarms, no broken glass. Someone entered the climate-controlled vault, where the primary cocoa butter samples are kept. They didn't steal anything, they left a gift. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial. He set it on Wolfe's desk. It contained a dark, viscous liquid. What is it? Wolfe asked, refusing to touch the vial. Extract valerian, Vane answered. Arid, his voice trembling slightly. In its concentrated form, it smells like a locker room in a swamp. If even a drop of that had been introduced to the mixing vats, 10,000 pounds of chocolate would have been fit for nothing but the trash heap. It was a warning, Mr. Wolfe, a demonstration of access. Wolfe leaned back, his chair creaking under the weight of his contemplation. You have security, I presume. Night watchman, cameras, biometric locks. The Duquesne factory is, by all accounts, a marvel of modern engineering. It is, Duquesne snapped, which means it was an inside job. It has to be. Only 5 people have the codes to the vault. Myself, Vane here, my sister Elena, our marketing director, Marcus Thorne, and the head of production. A man named Arthur Galt. Yes, related to our rivals, but we hired him away 3 years ago to prove a point. I was at my desk, my notebook open, taking down the names. A family affair, a disgruntled hire, and a marketing man, I remarked. That's a full deck. Why would your sister want to sabotage her own inheritance, Mr. Duquesne? Sterling scowled at me. Elena wants to sell. She's been in talks with a Swiss conglomerate for months. She hinks the company is a dinosaur. If the Centennial Gala is a disaster, The board will lose confidence in my leadership, and she'll get her majority vote to liquidate. Wolfe's eyes had gone half shut. And Mr. Thorne, the marketing director? Thorne is a genius with a branding iron, but he's a gambler, Vane chimed in. He's leveraged to his eyebrows in real estate. A buyout would give him a mass. I've payout on his stock options. But if the company stays independent and fails to grow, he's underwater. And the production head, Mr. Galt, Wolfe prompted. He's the wild card, Sterling said. He knows the machinery better than anyone. He's the one who discovered the altered roasting temperatures Jerome mentioned yesterday. He claims he caught it just in time. But I have to wonder if he's the one who set the dial in the first place. His cousin still runs Galt & Sons. Blood is thicker than chocolate, isn't it? Wolfe let out a long, slow breath. He hates cases that involve blood and family squabbles. They are messy, emotional, and rarely follow the rules of logic. However, he does love the mechanics of a specialized industry. I will require the presence of these individuals, Wolfe announced. Not here, not yet. Archie will accompany you to the factory today. He will act as my eyes and ears. He will observe the environment of your board and the physical layout of your vault. I don't want a private eye poking around the vats, Duquesne protested. The workers are already skittish. Then he shall be an insurance inspector, Wolfe said, closing the matter with a wave of his hand. Or a consultant on logistics. I don't care what you call him, but if he does not go, I do not act. Mr. Vane, you mentioned a $5,000 retainer. That was for the consultation. If I am to save your centennial, the fee will be considerably higher, and I shall require another $10,000 by noon today. Sterling Duquesne stared at Wolfe for a long moment, trying to find a crack in tea. He granted. He didn't find one. He stood up, signalled to Vane, and looked at me. Be at the factory at 2 o'clock, Mr. Goodwin. Ask for the executive suite, and try to look like you know something about insurance. I'll wear my most boring tie, I promised. After I showed them, I returned to the office. Wolfe was staring at the vial of valerian on his desk as if it were a poisonous spider. Well, I asked, are we going into the chocolate business, or are you just trying to get enough cash to buy that new batch of albuca bulbs from South Africa? Both, Archie, both. That vial is not just a threat, it is an insult. To use a foul-smelling botanical to threaten a refined palate is an act of intellectual thuggery. Go to the factory, look at their faces when you mention the word bitterness. And Archie, bring back a sample of the Midnight Velvet, the current batch. I wish to see exactly what is at stake. Right. 1 investigation, 1 box of candy. Should I check the tires on the Herode, or am I taking a cab? The Herode. I may need you to move quickly if Mr. Duquesne's sister is as eager to sell as he claims. People who want to liquidate often do so with fire. Brr. Grab my hat. E-game was afoot, and it smelled like roasted cocoa beans and old-fashioned greed. The Duquesne Chocolate Factory was a massive block of glass and steel in Long Island City that looked more like a surgical center than a place where they made things to eat. I arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, feeling less like an insurance inspector and more like a man walking into a hornet's nest that had been sprayed with sugar water. The air around the building was thick with the scent of roasting beans, a smell that is usually pleasant but, given the circumstances, felt a little suffocating. Sterling Duquesne's executive suite was on the top floor, overlooking the East River. It was filled with chrome, leather, and people who looked like they hadn't slept since the Eisenhower administration. Sterling was Thur, looking harried, and he introduced me to the 3 suspects I hadn't met yet. He called me Mr. Henderson from the underwriting firm, which I thought was a bit uninspired, but I rolled with it. Elena Duquesne, Sterling's sister, was the first to give me the once-over. She was lean, dressed in a suit that cost more than my car, and had eyes that could probably cut through a bank vault. She didn't. T looked like a woman interested in chocolate. She looked like a woman interested in spreadsheets and exit strategies. Next to her was Marcus Thorne, the marketing director, who was vibrating with a kind of nervous energy that usually comes from too much caffeine or a very bad hand at poker. He kept adjusting his tie and checking his watch. Finally, there was Arthur Galt, the production manager. He was a barrel-chested man with flowery-looking dust on his sleeves and a scowl that seemed permanently etched into his forehead. "Mr. Henderson is here to verify our security protocols for the centennial coverage," Sterling announced to the room. The lie sat in the air like a lead balloon. "Security protocols?" Elena laughed, and it sounded like glass breaking. "Sterling, the vault was breached last night, and someone left a bottle of perfume from the sewers on the pedestal. What is there to verify? The system is a joke, the company is a target, and we are hemorrhaging money on this centennial creme vanity project while Galt & Sons is eating our market share." "We aren't hemorrhaging anything, Elena," Thorne chimed in, though his voice lacked conviction. "The branding is solid. The Midnight T-Velvet line is still the gold standard. We just need a smooth launch. This sabotage, it's just a hiccup." "A hiccup?" Arthur Galt stepped forward, his voice a low rumble. "I've spent 20 years in chocolate, Thorne. You don't hiccup with the roasting temperatures. You don't hiccup with the alkalization. Someone went into my floor and messed with the settings on the drum roasters. If I hadn't smelled the char, we'd have ruined 5 tons of Criollo beans. Those beans aren't just expensive, they're irreplaceable this close to the deadline." I leaned against a mahogany sideboard and watched the show. "Who has the override codes for the roasters?" I asked, trying to sound like a bored insurance man. Galt turned his scowl on me. "I do, Sterling does, Vane does, and the computer in. The main office has a master log, but the log was wiped for that hour. Clean as a whistle." "How convenient," Elena remarked, lighting a cigarette despite the no smoking sign on the wall. She looked at her brother. "Admit it, Sterling, you're out of your depth. You're trying to play the grand visionary like grandfather, but you're just a man sitting on a melting ice cube. If we sell now, we all leave with our shirts. If we wait until Friday, and the gala is a disaster, we'll be lucky to sell the equipment for scrap." "I am not selling," Sterling said, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the Duquesne corporate colors. "And I don't appreciate the defeatism in front of our guest bar. Decided to stir the pot a little." Mr. Vane mentioned a note, something about a fading palette. Does that mean something to any of you?" The room went silent. Thorne looked at his shoes. Galt wiped his hands on a rag. Elena just blew a cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. "It's an old insult," Galt said finally. "In the industry, when a master chocolatier loses his edge, they say his palate is fading. It's a way of saying he's finished. Grandfather Duquesne said it about his rivals, to see it. In a note now. It's personal. It's someone who knows the history of this house, or someone who wants to burn it down," Elena added. "I spent the next hour doing a walkthrough of the facility. I saw the vats, the cooling tunnels, and the high-security vault that looked like it belonged in Fort Knox. I kept my eyes open and my mouth shut, noticing the little things, the way Thorne avoided looking at Galt, the way Elena lingered near the server room, and the way the entire staff seemed to be looking over their shoulders. Before I left, I made sure to grab a box of the current midnight velvet from the gift shop downstairs, as Wolfe had requested. As I walked to the Herode, I felt the weight of the suspect's stares from the top-floor window. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe would be waiting for my report, sitting in his chair, probably already knowing who the villain was just by the way I described the color of their eyes. But I knew better. In a house built on sugar, everyone has a reason to be bitter, and I had just met 4 people who were practically pickled in it. I returned to the brownstone just as the clock in the marble hallway struck 6. That meant Wolfe had descended from the plant rooms and was back in his element, which is to say, behind his desk with a glass of beer and a look of profound dissatisfaction with the world at large. I entered the office and found him exactly as expected. Fritz had already brought the tray with 2 bottles of Remmers and a chilled glass. "Well?" Wolfe asked, not looking up from a small pile of mail. "Is the air in Long Island City as ying as I imagine?" "Worse," I said, tossing my hat onto the rack and sliding the box of midnight velvet onto his desk. "It's a mix of burnt sugar and desperation. I met the lineup. If you're looking for a friendly face, you'd have better luck in a Shark Tank." I sat at my desk and gave him the full rundown. I described Elena Duquesne's cold efficiency, Marcus Thorne's twitchy nerves, and Arthur Galt's simmering resentment. I didn't leave out the detail about the Valerian vial or the fact that the computer logs had been scrubbed. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, his fingers interlaced over the center of his middle, his thumbs revolving slowly around each other, a sign that his brain was operating at a higher gear than the rest of us. The logs were wiped, Wolfe murmured. That requires more than a passing knowledge of their proprietary software. It requires intent and opportunity. What about physical layout, Archie? Did you see the vault? I saw it. It's a steel box inside a glass box. To get in, you need a biometric scan and a 6-digit code that changes daily, unless the person who entered has a twin brother and a photographic memory for shifting algorithms. It was one of the people I met. Orvain himself, and the atmosphere among them, like a funeral where everyone is checking the will to see if they got the car. Elena wants out. Thorn is broke and needs a buyout. Galt has a grudge older than the factory itself, and Sterling is trying to play the part of the king while the throne is on fire. Wolfe opened his eyes and looked at the box of chocolate I had brought. The legwork, Archie. I need more than impressions. I need history. Tomorrow you will find out what Marcus Thorn has been gambling on. People do not develop a twitch like that from playing penny ante poker. Also, I want to know about Arthur Galt's departure from his family's firm. One does not simply leave a family dynasty to work for the competition without a scar being left behind. The next tea morning, I was out of the house by 8. I spent 4 hours leaning on doors and making phone calls to people who owe me favors. By noon, I was sitting in a dusty office on 42nd Street with a guy named Lefty, who knows every bookie in the tri-state area. It turns out Marcus Thorn wasn't just gambling on real estate, he was shorting his own company's stock. If Duquesne Chocolate tanked, Thorn stood to make a killing. It's a neat trick if you can pull it off, but it's also a felony. Then I swung by a greasy spoon near the old Galt & Sons plant. I met a retired foreman who remembered Arthur Galt. He told me that Arthur hadn't left the family firm by choice. He'd been kicked out after a row with his cousin over a woman and a proprietary roasting technique. Arthur had vowed to prove that. He was the true keeper of the Galt legacy, even if he had to do it under a Duquesne banner. Got back to the brownstone around 3, feeling like I'd earned my keep. But when I entered the office, the atmosphere had shifted. The smell of chocolate was gone, replaced by something sharp and medicinal. Wolfe was sitting perfectly still, staring at the box of midnight velvet I had brought home the night before. One of the gold-wrapped squares was sitting on his blotter, unwrapped. It looked innocent enough, but the way Wolfe was looking at it made me keep my distance. "Did you try one?" I asked. "I did not," Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave. "I did, however, subject one to a basic solubility test in the kitchen. Archie, do you recall the note? The world will know that Duquesne is not. Hing but sugar and dust? Hard to forget. Why? Because this isn't chocolate. It is a sophisticated composite. The fat content has been replaced with a synthetic wax that mimics the melting point of cocoa butter, but it carries no flavor. It is, quite literally, flavored dust held together by a chemical lie. And this came from the gift shop, you say? Right off the shelf. Then the sabotage, it's not limited to the future centennial batch. It has already begun in the present. Someone is replacing the inventory with dross. If this reaches the public, the Duquesne name will be a punchline by Monday morning. E looked at me, and I saw the spark of a man who had finally found the thread he wanted to pull. Go to the kitchen, Archie. Tell Fritz I shall be 5 minutes late for tea. And bring me the phone. It is time we invited Mr. Saul Panzer to join our little confectionery circle. You think Saul can find the source of the wax? Saul will find where the real chocolate went. You don't dispose of 5 tons of premium midnight velvet by throwing it in the river. You sell it, and in this city there is only one person with the gall to buy it. The following morning, the sanctity of E. Brownstone was violated in a way that had nothing to do with fingerprints or broken locks. It happened at 7:15 a.m., an hour when the house is usually a well-oiled machine of silence and the smell of Fritz's cooking. I was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter and waiting for the coffee to finish dripping, when I noticed something wrong with the spice rack. It wasn't that anything was missing. It was that the jars had been shifted. The tarragon was where the mace usually sat, and the peppercorns had been moved to the front. To a normal person, this is a minor annoyance. To Fritz Brenner, it's a declaration of war. He was standing by the stove, his face pale, staring at a small ceramic jar of Hungarian paprika. "Archie," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "Look." He held out the jar. Inside, mixed with the deep red spice, was a coarse grey powder. It looked like fireplace ash, but when I took a sniff, it had that same chemical waxy odor I had smelled in the office the night before. Someone hadn't just breached the Duquesne factory, they had found their way into our home. They had bypassed the locks I check every night and left a calling card in the one place Wolfe considers a sanctuary, the kitchen. I didn't waste time. I didn't even pour the coffee. I went straight to the stairs and took them two at a time. I didn't knock on Wolfe's door. I walked in. He was sitting up in bed, propped against a mountain of pillows, reading a book on ancient metallurgy. He looked at me, his expression darkening as he saw my face. "Archie, it is 7:18. When, lest the house is on fire, you are trespassing." "The house isn't on fire," I said, "but the kitchen has been salted. Someone got in last night. They didn't take the silver or your orchid records. They spiked the paprika with that same synthetic dust from the factory. Fritz is downstairs looking like he's about to have a heart attack." Wolfe didn't move for long. He didn't even blink. He just sat there, the book resting on his massive lap, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop 20 degrees. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "They entered my house?" "They did, and they knew exactly where to go to get a reaction. It was a message, Nero. They're telling us that your intellectual dominance doesn't mean a thing if they can walk through your front door and touch your food." Wolfe pushed the covers aside. It was the fastest I'd seen him move in years. He didn't wait for his morning tea. He dressed in a silence that was louder than a shout. By the time we got downstairs, Fritz had cleared the spice rack and was scrubbing the counter as if he were trying to remove a stain from his soul. Wolfe walked to the rack, looked at the vacant spots, and then turned to me. "Check the doors, Archie. Check the windows. Check the basement grate." I did a full sweep. Everything was locked tight. There were no scratches on the deadbolts, no forced entries at the windows. Whoever had come in had either a key or a talent for locks that would make a master thief weep with envy. But more importantly, they knew the layout. They knew where Fritz kept the spices. "Thing," I reported, coming back into the office where Wolfe was now seated behind his desk. He hadn't touched his mail. "It's a ghost job. No signs of entry." "It was not a ghost," Wolfe snapped. "It was a provocation. They wish to rattle me. They wish to demonstrate that my fortress is glass. They have made a strategic error, Archie. They have shifted the contest from a matter of a client's FO. Tuned to a matter of my personal indignation." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. "The synthetic wax in the kitchen is identical to the substance in the Duquesne chocolates. This confirms that the saboteur is not merely an employee of the factory, but someone who has taken a particular interest in this investigation, and in us. You mentioned that Marcus Thorne was shorting the stock. You mentioned that Arthur Galt has a grudge. You mentioned Elena Duquesne wanting to liquidate. Which of them has the audacity to enter this house? But none of them look the type to pick a lock at 3 a.m., I admitted, but Thorne has the money to hire a pro, and Galt knows the chemistry. Elena, well, she has the ice water in her veins for it." Ulf tapped his fingers on the desk. "It is not a mat. Arv who could do it, but who benefited from the timing. I want the factory floor plans again, and I want to know who has been absent from their posts in the last 12 hours. Also, call Saul Panzer. Tell him to forget the chocolate for a moment. I want him to find out who in this city provides specialized entry services for the high-end corporate crowd. Someone was paid to come here, Archie. I want the name of the man who signed the check." The atmosphere in the brownstone had changed. The casual wit was gone, replaced by a cold, methodical focus. Wolfe wasn't just solving a case anymore. He was defending his borders. And as I picked up the phone to call Saul, I knew that the person who had tampered with Fritz's paprika had just made the biggest mistake of their life. You can steal, A man's money, and you can even threaten his life, but you never ever mess with Nero Wolfe's dinner. Saul Panzer arrived at the brownstone at 2 in the afternoon. Saul doesn't look like much. He's a small, wiry man with a cap pulled low and a nose that seems to have been designed specifically for sniffing out secrets. But he is the best operative in the business. If you told Saul to find a specify sea needle in a haystack the size of Ohio, he'd not only find the needle, but he'd tell you the name of the blacksmith who forged it. I let him in, and he followed me into the office, nodding a greeting to me before standing in front of Wolfe's desk. Wolfe was in the middle of his midday beer, but he set the glass down with more force than usual. The incident in the kitchen was still simmering in high gut, and I could tell he was ready to start swinging the hammer. "Sit, Saul," Wolfe invited. "Archie has told you of our domestic intrusion?" "He did, Mr. Wolfe," Saul said, taking the chair next to mine. "Dirty pool. I did the rounds you asked for. First, about the chocolate. You were right. You don't dump 5 tons of premium Criollo blend. You find a buyer who doesn't ask questions. I track a shipment of unmarked crates that moved out of the Duquesne loading docks 2 nights ago, just 4 hours after the security logs were wiped. They didn't go to a rival factory. They went to a warehouse in Brooklyn, owned by a shell company called Velvet Holdings." Burr leaned forward. "And who's behind Velvet Holdings, Burr? That's the beauty of it," Saul replied, a faint smirk touching his lips. "He paper trail for the shell company leads back to a law firm in Midtown. I did some digging, and that firm has exactly one major client on its books related to the confectionery industry, Marcus Thorne." "Thorne?" I whistled. "The marketing man. So he's stealing the real stuff to sell on the side while shorting the stock? That's double-dipping with a vengeance. It's more than that, Saul Contin." "You read," his voice dropping. I also looked into the specialized entry angle. There's a guy named the Ghost, real name Peter Vane. No relation to Jerome Vane, the chemist, but it's a funny coincidence. Peter is a high-end security consultant who spent 6 years in Sing Sing for burglary. I found out he was seen meeting a woman yesterday afternoon at a bistro near the Duquesne offices. From the Disca Ipschen the waiter gave me. It wasn't a marketing man. It was a tall, lean woman with ice in her eyes and a suit that cost a year's rent. "Elena Duquesne," I said. "So we have a brother and sister act. Marcus steals the product to ruin the company's value, and Elena hires a pro to spook us, so we'll tell her brother the case is too dangerous to handle. She wants him to cave and sell Ulf grunted. A sound of deep-seated skepticism. He began to drum his fingers on the desk, a rhythmic thud that filled the room. "No, it is too neat, Archie. Too many threads left dangling for us to trip over. If Mr. Thorne is stealing the chocolate, why would he use a law firm so easily traced? If Miss Duquesne hired a burglar, why would she meet him in a public bistro where a waiter could describe her? They are professional deceivers. They would not be so clumsy. Maybe they're just arrogant," I suggested. "They think we're just a couple of guys in a house on 35th Street. "They know better now," Wolfe said. "Saul, what of Arthur Galt? Did he have any part in this Velvet Holdings?" "Galt is clean on the paperwork," Saul said. "But he's been making phone calls to his cousin at Galt & Sons every night this week. And there's something else. Jerome Vane, our client, hasn't been back to his own apartment in 2 days. He's been staying at a hotel under a false name. He says he's scared, but he's also been seen making large cash withdrawals." Wolfe stood up. This was the signal that the thinking was done, and the positioning was about to begin. When Wolfe stands before he has to, it means he's decided on a move that's going to make everyone uncomfortable. "Archie, tomorrow morning you will return to the factory, not go as an insurance inspector, go as yourself. Tell Mr. Sterling Duquesne that I have found the source of the bitterness, but I require one final piece of evidence from the vault itself. I want you to watch the reactions of the board members when you tell them that the Midney Velvet is being sold on the black market. Do not mention Marcus Thorne by name. Let the poison work on its own." "And what about the burglar?" I asked. "If Elena really did hire the Ghost to come into our kitchen, shouldn't I be having a talk with her about my choice of spices?" "Later," Wolfe said, his eyes gleaming. "For now, we must allow them to believe their maneuvers are succeeding. I want you to stay in that warehouse in Brooklyn. If a single ounce of that stolen chocolate moves, I want to know where it goes. And Saul, if you see Peter Vane, do not engage. Simply follow. I want to see whose door he knocks on when he realizes he's being watched. I spent the rest of the evening cleaning my 38 and wondering which of our suspects was the most likely to crack first. The set. Up was getting crowded. We had a marketing man shorting stock, a sister trying to force a sale, a production head talking to the enemy, and a client who was hiding in a hotel, and somewhere in the middle of it all was a grey powder that had ruined Fritz's paprika and made Nero Wolfe lose his temper. By the time I went to bed, the house was silent, but it wasn't the usual peaceful silence. It was the kind of quiet you get right before a storm breaks. I checked the locks 3 times, but I knew that wasn't the point. The point wasn't to keep people out anymore, it was to draw them in. Wolfe was baiting the hook, and tomorrow we'd see which of the Duquesne sharks was hungry enough to bite brah. Woke up at dawn. The air in the brownstone was crisp, and the smell of coffee was back to being untamed. Fritz was in the kitchen, his shoulders still a bit stiff, but he was back in control of his domain. I hastily ate breakfast and headed to the garage. As I drove toward Long Island City, I thought about the way the pieces were fitting together. It felt like a puzzle where every piece was the right color but the wrong shape. Thorne, Elena, Galt, Vane, they all had a motive to see the company ale or change hands, but only one of them had the specific brand of malice required to walk into our home and leave a calling card in the spice jar. That wasn't just business, that was a grudge, and grudges in the Rex Stout world usually ended with someone getting a much more permanent taste of bitterness than anything found in a chocolate bar. I pulled up to the Duquesne factory at 9 sharp. The morning sun was hitting the glass facade, making it look like a giant block of ice. I parked the Herald, checked my tie in the rearview mirror, and headed for the executive elevator. It was time to throw a stone into the pond and see how many snakes came to the surface. I stepped into the executive wing of the Duquesne building and didn't bother waiting for a secretary to announce me. I walked straight into the boardroom where the air was so thick with tension you could have used it as a structural support. They were all there, Sterling looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight, Elena tapping a manicured fingernail against a mahogany table, Marcus Thorne sweating through his silk shirt, and Arthur Galt standing by the window, looking out at the factory floor like a captain watching his ship sink. Jerome Vane was there too, having finally emerged from his hotel hideout, looking twitchy and pale. "Good morning," I said, leaning against the doorframe and letting my jacket fall back just enough to show the holster. "I hope I'm not interrupting a wake. Mr. Wolfe sent me over to deliver a progress report, though I suppose for some of you it'll sound more like a weather warning. Stir." Ling Duquesne stood up, his hands trembling. "What is it, Goodwin? Did you know who is doing this? The gala is tomorrow night. The press is already calling Oh, we've found out plenty," I said, strolling toward the center of the room. "We found out that 5 tons of your premium midnight velvet didn't just vanish into thin air. It moved through your loading docks and ended up in a warehouse in BR. We also found out that someone has been shorting Duquesne stock so aggressively they're practically begging for the company to fail. And just to keep things interesting, someone decided to pay a visit to our house on 35th Street last night to play a little prank with some synthetic wax stopper. His reaction was a symphony of guilty looks. Marcus Thorne turned the color of a bad oyster and looked like he was about to bolt for the fire escape. Elena didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed into slits. Arthur Galt let out a short, harsh laugh that didn't have any humor in it. "A warehouse in Brooklyn?" Sterling whispered, turning to Thorne. "Marcus? It's not what it looks like," Thorne stammered, his voice climbing an octave. "I was securing the inventory, with all the talk of a buy. Out, I thought we needed a reserve that wasn't on the official books. It was a strategic move. Selling it to a shell company you own is a funny way to secure it," I remarked. "But you're not the one who went into our kitchen, Thorne. You don't have the stomach for it. You're a book cooker, not a housebreaker." I turned my attention to Elena. "And then we have the lady of the house. You've been meeting with a security consultant named Peter Vane, better known to the police as the Ghost." He's very good with locks. I assume you hired him to show us how easy it was to get past our security, hoping Mr. Wolfe would decide this case was a headache he didn't need. You want this company sold, and you want us out of the way so your brother will finally sign the papers." Elena smiled, a cold N line. "Mr. Goodwin, if I wanted you out of the way, I wouldn't send a man to mess with your spice rack. I would simply buy the mortgage on that dusty brownstone and have you evicted." Peter Vane was hired to audit our factory security because my brother is clearly incapable of doing it. If he went to your house, he did so on his own initiative. "That's a lie," Jerome Vane suddenly shouted. "Stand." Ing up so fast his chair flipped over. "She's been pushing for the sale since the day the old man died. She's the one who told me the formula was compromised. She's the one who put the idea in my head that we were being sabotaged." The room erupted. Sterling was shouting at his sister. Thorne was trying to explain his Brooklyn warehouse to a wall, and Jerome Vane was practically vibrating with hysteria. Only Arthur Galt remained silent, still looking out the window. I watched him. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry. He looked like a man who was waiting for a timer to go off. "Quiet!" I yelled, and the authority in my voice actually worked. Mr. Wolfe has a very specific way of handling these things. He doesn't like shouting, and he doesn't like messy boardrooms. He has requested the usher of your company at the brownstone tonight at 9 o'clock. All of you, including Mr. Vane here. "I'm not going anywhere," said Galt, finally turning. "I have a factory to run. We're trying to salvage the centennial batch." "You'll be there, Mr. Galt," I said, meeting his gaze. "Because if you aren't, the next person who comes through that door won't be a private eye with a sense of humor. It'll be Inspector Kramer with a fleet of squad cars and a warrant for industrial espionage. Mr. Wolfe knows exactly how the roasting temperatures were altered, and he knows exactly who has the chemical knowledge to create a synthetic wax that mimics cocoa butter. He's just waiting to explain it to you in person." I didn't wait for them to agree. I turned on my heel and walked out, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the sudden, heavy silence of the room. I had done what Wolfe asked. I had tightened the net and let them see the mesh. Now all that was left was the gathering. Driving back, I felt the familiar hum of a case nearing its end, but there was still a splinter in my mind. Wolfe had mentioned that the sabotage was an insult to a master's palate. He had been more offended by the cruelty of the fake chocolate than the break-in. To Wolfe, the crime wasn't just the theft or the stock manipulation, it was the degradation of an art form. When I got back to the house, Wolfe was in the office, but he wasn't behind his desk. He was standing by the large globe, spinning it slowly with one finger. "They're coming," I said, hanging up my hat. "Thorne is falling apart, Elena is digging. G in, and Galt is acting like a man who's already seen the end of the movie. And Jerome Vane? He's the most scared of the lot." "Good," Wolfe said, stopping the globe. "The stage is set, Archie. Fritz is preparing the refreshments. Not the midnight velvet, of course. We shall serve the sourdough biscuits with the blackberry preserve. I want our guests to have a taste of something genuine before W.E. expose the fraud they've been living in." "You've got it figured out then, the whole thing?" "I have known the who since you brought me that box of dust yesterday, Archie. The how was a matter of simple chemistry. The why, well, that is the most interesting part of all. It isn't greed, and it isn't even ambition. It is something much older and much more bitter." He turned to look at me, and I saw that he was no longer angry about the kitchen. He was calm, focused, and entirely lethal. "Tell Fritz to bring me a beer, and Archie, make sure the red leather chair is positioned exactly where it belongs. I want them to feel the weight of this room when they enter it." I went to the kitchen to find Fritz. The brownstone felt like a trap that was finally ready to be sprung. In a few hours, 5 people would sit in that office, and only one of them would leave with their reputation intact. I checked the clock. 7 o'clock, 2 hours to go. I decided to spend them checking the service of my 38 again. In this house, the final revelation usually came with words, but out on the street, people sometimes preferred lead. The evening air was cooling, and the city sounds were muffled by the thick stone walls. Everything was in its place. The orchids were sleeping on the roof, the beer was cold, and Nero Wolfe was ready to deliver justice. It was just another night on West 35th Street, but for the Duquesne family, it was about to be the longest night of their lives. The office felt like a courtroom where the judge had already decided on the hanging. Sterling Duquesne, Elena, Marcus, Thorne, Arthur Galt, and Jerome Vane were arranged in a semicircle of leather and mahogany facing the desk where Nero Wolfe sat. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the wall clock and the faint sound of Thorne's heavy breathing. Wolfe didn't look like a man about to solve a mystery. He looked like a man who had been deeply inconvenienced and was now going to make Yon pay for it in 10-syllable words. He took a final sip of his beer, set the glass down with a precise click, and leaned forward, his eyes traveling over the suspects like a beam of cold light. "We are here," Wolfe began, his voice a low, melodic rumble, "because a venerable institution is being dismantled by a pack of termites. You have all, in your own ways, contributed to the decay of the D.U. Kane name. Mr. Thorne, your pathetic attempts to profit from the failure of your own employer through stock manipulation and the theft of inventory are not only illegal but remarkably unimaginative. You are a clerk with the soul of a scavenger, and while your crimes are significant, you are not the architect of this particular nightmare." Thorne opened his mouth to protest, but Wolfe's gaze moved. To Elena, "Miss Duquesne, your desire to liquidate the company is no secret. You hired a common burglar to trespass in my home, an act of egregious folly, simply to frighten me away from an investigation that might save your brother's legacy. You wanted the company to seem unsalvageable so that the board would vote for a sale. You are a cold woman, madam, but you are also pragmatic. You would not destroy the value of the very asset you wish to sell. Sabotaging the product itself would be like burning a house you are trying to flip for a profit. You are dismissed from the primary suspicion, though you will likely find the police interested in your association with Mr. Peter Vane." Elena didn't move a muscle. She just stared at Wolfe with a look of icy detachment. "That leaves us with the midnight velvet itself," Wolfe continued, his voice sharpening. "The alteration of the roasting temperatures, the wiping of the logs, and the introduction of a synthetic wax that mimics the properties of cocoa butter. This required more than just access. It required a profound understanding of the chemistry of chocolate and the mechanics of the Duquesne vats. Mr. Galt, why have the knowledge? You also have the motive of a man scorned by his own family, seeking to prove that the Duquesne success was a fluke that you could end with a flick of a switch. But you, too, are a man of the craft. Saw your face when you spoke of the ruined beans. You could no more intentionally produce a box of dust than I could intentionally overwater an orchid. It is a physical impossibility for a master to commit such an aesthetic atrocity." Galt grunted, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Then who, Wolfe? Who else knows the vats? Who else knows chemistry?" Wolfe's eyes shifted, landing on the man in the corner who had been trying to blend into the shadows. "The person who first brought the sabotage to my attention. The man who sat in that chair and played the part of the panicked scientist, Mr. Jerome Vane." The room went still. Jerome Vane blinked, a bead of sweat on his forehead. "Me? That's preposterous. I'm the one who hired you. I'm the one who found the note." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "The note. The master's palette is fading." A phrase you claimed was an old industry insult, but as Archie discovered, it was a phrase used specifically by Grandfather Duquesne. "You weren't just attacking a company, Mr. Vane. You were attacking a ghost. You have been the chief chemist for 12 years, yet you remained a secondary figure, a shadow to the Duquesne name. You realized that if the company flourished under Sterling, you would remain a footnote, but if the company failed, and if it failed because the secret formula you managed was exposed as a fraud, you could emerge from the ruins. Galt & Sons had already approached you with an offer to head their new research wing, provided you brought something substantial with you." "That's a lie," Vane shouted, his voice cracking. "Is it? Saul Panzer spent the afternoon tracing your large cash withdrawals. They didn't pay the hotel bill. They went to a New Jersey lab specializing in synthetic polymers. You did. And find the wax, Mr. Vane. You invented it. You used the Duquesne vats to test it, and you used the cover of sabotage to hide your experiments. You were the one who wiped the logs. You were the one who entered this house to plant that powder in our kitchen, using a key you stole from Archie's pocket while he was distracted by your distress during your first visit. You thought that by making the threat personal to me, I would focus on the board members and ignore the man who sat right in front of me. Wolfe leaned back, his thumbs beginning their slow circle. But you made a fatal error. You assumed your fear would move me. I am never moved by fear, I am moved by logic. And logically, the only person who could have known exactly which spice jar in my kitchen would cause the most distress to my chef was someone who had spent the morning observing the meticulous nature of this household. You saw Fritz's standards. You saw the order of this room. You chose the paprika because it was the most vibrant thing in the kitchen, a direct parallel to the midnight velvet you were turning to ash. Vane looked around the room, but there were no friends left. Sterling was staring at him with a mix of horror and betrayal. I moved toward the door, just in case he decided to try a sprint, but he didn't have the legs for it. He simply collapsed back into his chair, the air leaving him in a long, rattling sigh. I spent my life making them millions, Vane whispered. And they didn't even know my middle name. I wanted to show them that without me, their chocolate was nothing but sugar and dust. I was the one who made it velvet. Not the Duquesnes, me, a common delusion of the embittered, Wolfe said, his voice devoid of pity. Archie, if you would be so good as to call Inspector Kramer, tell him we have a chemist who needs to discuss the laws regarding industrial sabotage, breaking and entering, and the theft of trade secrets. Mr. Duquesne, I believe you will find the original formula remains intact in your vault. Mr. Vane was too vain to actually destroy the one thing he felt he owned. He merely masked it. The aftermath was a blur of blue uniforms and Sterling Duquesne's stuttered thanks. By 11 o'clock, the brownstone was empty again, save for the three of us. The smell of the Duquesne Empire had finally vanished, replaced by the comforting aroma of Fritz's late-night cocoa. The real kind, made with heavy cream and a pinch of cinnamon. Wolfe sat at his desk, staring at the empty space where the valerian vial had been. Human folly, Archie, is the only thing in this world that never requires a formula. It is produced spontaneously, in great quantities, and always with the same bitter aftertaste. Well, I said, leaning against the doorframe and taking a sip of my own. Drink. At least the kitchen is back to normal. Fritz found a new source of paprika, and the bank account is 5 figures heavier. I'd call that a sweet ending. Wolfe looked at his glass of cocoa, then up at me. Sweetness is a facade, Archie. It is the balance of the bitter that gives it character. Remind me tomorrow to never accept a case involving confectionery again. I find the industry's reliance on sugar to be a tiresome metaphor for the public's appetite for deception. Sure thing, boss, I said, heading for the stairs, until the next time someone tries to salt your eggs. Wolfe didn't answer. He just picked up his book on the Habsburgs and began to read the master of his own fortress once more, while the rest of the city went back to its business of bane, beautifully, hopelessly complicated.